I see we are started. Welcome, Eric, Sheila, Dejan, and Sabukwe. If you can't hear me, you need to throw a flag up so I'll know if something's wrong. If you don't, I'll assume you can hear me. And this session is scheduled to start 4:20 my time, 20 after the hour, wherever you are. So we're going to wait 4 more minutes for others to join us. So why don't I use these first couple of minutes while people are getting on to say a bit about myself and where I am before I actually start the talk. I'm actually sitting here in Chwani, occupied Azania as we refer to it, and some others still want to remain to call it the Republic of South Africa, but that's the apartheid settler name for it. Um, I've been here since 2014, living here and organizing with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And we are here organizing not only in occupied Azania, but we're also do work with other areas in Southern Africa, Zambia, Namibia, and Swaziland. And right now, Swaziland is on fire, as many of you know, with the collective effort by a number of organizations to end the absolute monarchy that exists there. This is a particular form of neo-colonialism that I will speak some about when I begin my talk. So I'm going to do a screen share. Hopefully I can get this right. So I want to start this before I actually get going, so we can be sure to have it right. I think it's in order to start by thanking the organizers of this conference. I know the All African People's Revolutionary Party has been an active part of the organizing committee, but it was spearheaded by a couple of key people that introduced the conference, or introduced the day. I know Sister Hattie has been very much involved in assisting us in terms of registration and the handling of this particular tool. And I'm hoping that this will be a fruitful conference that will leave us with a higher level of unity. So I'm going to start to keep with the timing. And you should see my first slide here is just the introduction of the topic that I'm talking about. So in terms of looking at the history and the present manifestations, I want to cover this in three levels. First, the backdrop in terms of capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism, which really led us to the space we're in. And then secondly, briefly talking about our fight for political liberation. And then how, what ended up as a result, is what I'm calling the compromise of neo-colonialism. So one of the first things we need to do when discussing capitalism is to dismiss this notion that capitalism promotes, that it's somehow this creative ingenuity that has allowed someone uh, to create the next Apple computer or Netflix or any of these other entities, that is somehow this genius that has allowed them to create these institutions, these industries, and to realize that capitalism has been built on two things: slavery and the theft of land. Land has been the fundamental source of all productions from day one till now, in that it's the source of not only food, it's the source of the timber to build houses, it's the source of the raw materials that are mined that are then used to build all levels of complex machinery and devices. And it was slavery that allowed the combination of the working of this stolen land to generate the massive amount of wealth that allowed the capitalists, early merchant capitalists, to then have more wealth that then could extend their ability to build machinery, to build plants, to build textile industries, to process the cotton. All of this was a result of these two things: the theft of land and enslavement of people. So in this process, particularly of the theft of land, independent indigenous states were violently attacked, disrupted. We saw high levels of genocide from the Canary Islands in the earliest invasions in the 14th century to later in terms of the Americas and Australia and New Zealand. We saw the attempts across Southern Africa. This not only stealing of land, but this near genocidal process that opened up opportunities for Europeans to basically expand in terms of building of this capitalism. So this colonial expansion was a suppression of indigenous peoples in continents across the planet. And it's important to understand the significance of this, because here you have a aggressive capitalist class coming out of Europe in states that are actually very small compared to those that they came to dominate. One looks on the map and looks at Portugal and see the size of Portugal, and then looks at Brazil and Angola and Mozambique, which became those colonial possessions. Then we can get a better sense of the extensive nature of this stolen land and how the resources led to these smaller, in terms of territory, capitalist countries emerging. So the wealth came from the colonized states. The initial efforts were to just seize islands. So we see that the earlier efforts were you saw Jamaica or other islands in the Caribbean because it was easier just to go in, wipe out the Carib Indians, and bring in slaves and set up a plantation. It was easier to do that than try to seize and maintain lands in a larger mass, such as Canada or what became the United States. But over time, they extended the settlerism that allowed for them uh, to create the genocidal efforts that expanded into what became uh, settler colonies and what became eventually what I refer to as settler capitalism. So, in this process of extending capitalism and its wealth, it built the manufacturing sector and the banking sector, and it advanced uh, to the state of imperialism. But what I want to emphasize on this, in terms of this process of capitalist development, is this major settler states that are now operating under settler capitalism. But this phase of settler colonialism not only created Canada and the United States and New Zealand and Australia, and are now endeavoring to expand this artificial state of Israel, but also during this period up until uh, early part of this 20th, later part of the 20th century, we saw settler colonialism in Algeria and across southern Africa. Many people don't realize that Algeria was a settler state that France attempted to annex to it, and that after the Algerian Revolution, a massive number of millions of French got on boats and had to go back, because before the Algerian Revolution, the largest sector of Europeans in Africa were in Algeria. So we need to understand this process of settler colonialism that led us to settler capitalism. So the rise of imperialism, uh, we saw the creation of monopolies in industry and finance. One of the earliest ones being the steel industry. With the building of the railroads and this advance of industrial revolution, the steel industry grew, and it became a stockholding entity, no longer the initial capitalist entities that were owned by individuals. And this was one of the things that advanced imperialism, this notion of stockholding entities that were both financial or industry. And the merger of this monopoly setup of finance, capital, and industrial monopolies has created these oligarchies within the major capitalist countries. And the next aspects of that was the export of capital. Early colonialism was a matter of just extracting materials and selling trinkets to us in Africa or in other colonized spaces. But then the export of capital became one of actually developing the mechanisms to exploit at a higher level. And this is what has arisen not only in terms of the colonial countries, but also in terms of the smaller capitalist countries. So this territorial division of the world had become complete by the early part of the 20th century. So in this backdrop, we have the struggle for political liberation. And then we have anti-colonial campaigns, both those that were part of the Pan-African conferences and congresses that were mentioned earlier today, and those that took place on our lands in Africa or in the Caribbean. And then we had the efforts to isolate the colonial powers in terms of actually exposing them to those countries that were now, and those individuals within countries who saw colonialism as bad. And the classic example of that was the efforts in isolating South Africa and the European settlers that controlled that under apartheid. but most effective in the liberation struggles, whether we're talking about the Philippines or whether we're talking about Cuba or whether we're talking about Africa, was the armed struggle. And within that armed struggle, we had different liberation movements. But the key to understand where we have come to today is how these liberation movements then moved into become post-colonial political parties, and that how with this they took on different forms. They took on forms of being anti-neocolonial, anti-capitalist, and those that were clearly in favor of capitalism, and those that saw some level of merger. So this is what we're looking at, the base of capitalism, but on that in terms of how it evolved, in terms of expressing itself beyond borders, in terms of imperialism, and how that evolved in terms of once political power was given back to the masses, or supposedly, that we've arrived at a situation of neocolonialism. So to speak to the different faces of neocolonialism, Nkrumah's classic work on neocolonialism holds the day in terms of how he dissects this. First, we have this capitalist intelligence manipulation that can extend from the CIA and other intelligence agencies that work to disrupt, to what has been written about in terms of these economic hitmen who use a different level of intelligence information about the resources and the weaknesses of people in the government or people in institutions to cook up different types of proposals that they have governments agree to, and quite often are unaware of the fact that they are exploitative proposals and projects that these economic hitmen initiate. So this is part of the broader intelligence manipulation. Then we clearly have the military interventions. And this can be from internal coups that are cooked up by the CIA to actual invasions. But what's significant about this also is this threat of such things happening that sort of hoover over many states, that they know that there could be a step away from having a coup occur, so they tread lightly in terms of the types of decisions they may do, even when they may have good intentions in terms of the people. So we have to understand this as part of the neocolonial mechanism. Then we have the so-called manipulation using aid, stemming from the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Club of Paris, and then we have the insidious ones that are linked to particular states like USAID, which clearly is an effort to sort of give this kind of media propaganda that was talked about in the last talk, spin on it, but actually is about exploiting and controlling in terms of neocolonialism. And the so-called non-governmental organizations, which have proliferated in an effort, and actually what they do is they become sources or resources for reactionary elements in that are opposed quite usually to the more progressive elements in a particular neocolonial state. And then we have the media manipulation. This could be anything from what we see in terms of the images projected through the movie industry. One of the pervasive ones that I saw living in different states in Africa was the Voice of America. The Voice of America is on the radio in literally dozens of different African languages, and not only African languages, but you'll find it in all countries. They find someone that can actually speak the different languages, and they put monies in so that they are actually, they give this image of being more professional than the local radio stations, and this manipulation is very pervasive. We also see it within everything from the BBC to CNN. This dominating of education and religious networks. And Nkrumah talked about in his book on neocolonialism how this evangelism that came right after, in many states, right after colonialism ended, became very pervasive. Uh, but also within the educational sphere, because we see the need to educate more of our people and our youth, but so often the approach that's been adopted is that based on the capitalist countries. And then we see the financial manipulation. Countries have credit ratings. We regularly hear, every couple of months here in occupied Tanzania, we hear reports saying the credit rating for South Africa is going down, or because they have this debt, or because this has happened. So these, all these credit ratings are coming out of the West and basically manipulate, so that if your credit rating goes down, then your country's bonds, your country's credit in general, ability to access funds is reduced. So it's this fear that we hear here in occupied Tanzania constantly about the country's credit rating going down. And then the trade relationships, from the World Trade Organization to what we see in terms of trade sanctions, uh, this whole AGOA bit that the U.S. has set up in terms of saying, okay, certain things can be traded if you trade, allow this to go on. So this is a form of manipulation. But I highlight here the multinational corporations, because this has traditionally been the highest form of exploitation under neo-colonialism. This started with colonialism, but and it's primarily linked with extractive industries, whether it's the mining of copper in Chile, or whether it's the mining of cobalt in Zimbabwe, or diamonds in Botswana. Uh, this has been the approach that has been taken. And extractive industries could be also crop industries like cocoa in Ghana, or tea in Kenya. So these extractive industries have been the major source, run by multinationals uh, that control the pricing, and and create a situation where there's major exploitation. So the different manifestations of neocolonial, this is the last major slide I'm going to deal with, because we see that its expression taking shape in different uh, forms in different places. So the first I have here is apartheid forces maintain economic dominance under the name of South Africa. Because of the infrastructure and the extensive nature of the industry, not only the mining industry, but even manufacturing, that was controlled by the apartheid regime, just to turn over the political mechanism and allow people to vote, it had nothing to do, it changed nothing in its apparatus. It changed nothing in terms of who owned the banks. It changed nothing in terms of who owned the mines. So this as allowed those multinationals that were sanctioned under apartheid to actually grow, because now they're deemed to be legitimate South African uh, corporations. The legitimacy that they've gained by the end of apartheid has created more wealth for these apartheid forces, has created more exploitation on the whole, and has created more of a divide in wealth between the poorest people in this country and the wealthiest. So that South Africa is the largest divide between the wealthy and the poor of any country on the planet. So then we see the second type I mentioned here, sanctions, and the NGOs that we see existing in Zimbabwe that have created all kinds of problems. And this is a insidious form where, they said, okay, Zimbabwe, we're kicking you out of the Commonwealth, and then we're creating sanctions, we're freezing assets, we're not allowing members of ZANU-PF to come into Europe or the U.S. And it was even documented by the opposition MDC leadership how billions of dollars were lost in terms of development of Zimbabwe because of this. the use of NGOs, the attempt to defeat ZANU-PF in elections was largely engineered by NGOs being able to bring in dollars and give out aid packages and monies and hire people, uh, and to pose as if this was uh, the future of Zimbabwe if you voted for MDC. It failed, but this is a real tactic that's used by neocolonialism in terms of attempting to disrupt uh, efforts to end neocolonialism. Third, I have on this list the manipulation of primary extractive resources. And we've seen that in cases where countries are largely dependent on one or two uh, resources, such as the dominance of oil in Nigeria, Gabon, and Angola, diamonds in Botswana, that basically the manipulation of this resource, a single resource, has allowed uh, those multinational entities to really dominate within that situation. We see the next instance, and this is where I mentioned earlier that we some of us engage in working with our comrades in Swaziland because the support for undemocratic monarchies. Uh, these are three monarchies that are still in Africa. Swaziland is an absolute monarchy. Uh, the other two are semi monarchies, but we recognize the notion of a monarchy with the king uh, is totally undemocratic. It's totally against the notion of what justice loving people stand for. But you have the capitalist and imperialist powers who use their by supporting these undemocratic monarchies. They basically this is the inroads and the particular manifestation that we see of neocolonialism. Then we see those that are still under neocolonialism, but try to have some level of pragmatic engagement. And I use Rwanda as an example because they on one hand had pushed the French out and refused to be part of the French currency system, but then at the same time engage with insisting to work with Israel under the umbrella of the fact that they had this shared genocidal experience with Jewish people. And then on the other hand, when I lived there in 2006, the two largest uh, projects in terms of building were the U.S. embassy and the Chinese embassy. So they consider themselves to be pragmatic in terms of how they're engaging, but the reality of it is still under a neo-colonial environment. They don't uh, have any level of control over the prices uh, that they pay for goods. They don't have any level of control over the reality in terms of their currency with regards to the international currency, and they're still very much dependent on the same types of entities like the IMF and the World Bank. So, what is the solution? First of all, we need a revolutionary African intelligentsia to really speak to a better understanding of the complexity of neocolonialism, imperialism, and capitalism itself. Within that effort, we need to work to build a worldwide Pan-African movement and eventually an all-African committee of political coordination. It's unfortunate at the same time I'm giving this talk, some of my comrades are giving a talk on the all-African committee for political coordination. Hopefully those in this session will get a chance to listen to that. And then the building of an all-African people's political party, revolutionary political party, uh, that's inclusive, that's mass based is key, and this all has to lead us to an organized effort to bring about Pan Africanism, which we concisely define as the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. So I'm going to stop my share at this point and okay. So So I'm now open to any kind of questions or additions that people may have in terms of the this whole conception of neocolonialism. Okay, I see one point being raised. Kagame is an opportunist and has his military trained by the U.S., if I recall, a neocolonial puppet with autonomy. Certainly, by all means, Rwanda is a one-party state. I mean, they have so-called elections, but there's no, nominal opposition. And Kagame certainly came out of a military environment. Um, when I lived there, though, I did note that he was very quick to arrest comrades that were being corrupt, and that he one of the things that they were promoting was both education and expending more money in terms of actually developing scientifically, and also in terms of engaging in state-owned enterprises actually operating for the benefit of people. But I can argue against the fact that they are engaged with the U.S. in terms of training. Also, when I was there, it was noted that they operated with a number of other forces from the east, also in terms of that. But uh, I think this is something to explore, the notion of a neo-colonial puppet, um, because I'm certainly not advocating any of these neo-colonial situations as the ideal model. We see actually the the efforts that are most extensively pushed in terms of opposing the development are areas where our people are struggling the hardest to end neocolonialism, and that is certainly the example of the land reclamation in Zimbabwe. Um, so don't get the impression that I'm trying to promote. What I'm trying to present, though, is the reality that many African leaders taking this approach that they consider to be pragmatic. Even when I lived there and I argued for socialism, their argument was we have to be pragmatic or else there'll be another genocide, and that's why we really want Pan Africanism. But right now we have to do these things so that we can advance and stabilize, and that was the situation. Okay, I'm trying to see other questions, points. African leaders are not dumb. They understand the reality of true liberation in a capitalist system controlled by the West. You have to be very pragmatic and shrewd in your approach to freedom. That, and this is the argument that, some of my comrades in Rwanda gave, in terms of feeling that they were Pan Africanists and socialists, but felt that they had to be pragmatic. And I'm I think there's a limit to that. You have to push for revolution, but you also have to realize where if certain you do certain things, you're going to get killed, or you're gonna your forces are going to be wiped out. So I mean, just as if you engaged when our forces were engaged in armed struggle across southern Africa, they realized that they just couldn't run right into the capital, guns blazing, and they realized that the development took steps. And this is what we're faced with, I think, now. It says the global should really ban NGOs. China banned them in Hong Kong, and those protests dried up pretty quickly. Um, that's an interesting point, and I know in Zimbabwe, um, there was they were very manipulative, but at the same time, uh, people were dependent on some of this as resources for, particularly as they put the crunch on the Zimbabwe currency. And the notion of a non-governmental organization is like that of a nonprofit. So you have some that actually do good, but so sorting that few out, I mean, because if you think of the notion of a nonprofit that's chartered to help with education or chartered to help with health, that sounds pretty good. But if in reality many of these are fronts for either the U.S. or British intelligence, or are promoted by blatant capitalists like uh, Bill Gates is a classic example. Bill Gates is involved in supporting all kinds of efforts in terms of the umbrella NGOs, but he's clearly, his agenda is maintaining capitalism. In terms of maintaining capitalism, he wants to maintain imperialism and neocolonialism. So you can put a pretty face on it, but you had to realize really what's happening with these. Okay, let's see. To Walimu, John, how much effort is being taken across Africa and in some countries in particular to harness and implement inexpensive, appropriate technologies, making use of country-based natural resources to jumpstart economies and the optimization of infrastructure enhancement? Um, can you provide examples? Well, actually, one of the things I've been engaged in the last 20 years is the International Network on Appropriate Technology. And there are efforts to support the technology that empowers communities. I know, for instance, one of our comrades in Kenya who has set up in remote areas um, uh, water systems for women's collectives, and also use the use of micro hydro, which is basically a small hydro pump that you can put in a stream in a rural area to provide electricity. So these are just a couple of examples that our organization, the International Network on Appropriate Technology, has promoted. Um, but their efforts um, in terms of and I mentioned, I see Obiani mentioning a water mill. Uh, that's example. The case that Conrad Kinua was doing was more like a water pump that leveraged the gravity basically to pump water up to uh, uh, a, a, to a higher level, and then they could then use to be drained down. But there were various. There was actually an appropriate technology center when in Rwanda when I was there, that actually looked at everything from biodigesters to solar efforts. And they're right out the edge of Kigali was one of the first places they actually built um, a solar farm, basically a set of solar panels to have a solar facility in that part. So there are various efforts along this line, and it's about trying to empower local communities. One of, I think, the important emphasis that can be done along that line is alternative energy, because I mean Africa has more sunlight than any other a continent, and it's underutilized, and also solar is a more decentralized source of generating electricity, and the generation of electricity is sort of a cornerstone of any type of development at this point, because not only does it allow you to have lighting, but it allows for all sorts of other types of processing on a small and even larger scale. So this is seen as key. And the second is actually the providing of clean water, which we know that the lack of clean water is one of the things that has hindered our communities across Africa and the global South. Are there other questions? Let's see, where are we in terms of time? Uh, okay. Trying to navigate this can be a little tricky. Okay. Okay, so we actually have 20 minutes left. So let's see, if I can see if there are particular questions being raised. Okay. Okay, so most people have been putting in the chat and not in the Q&A. Like anything in the Q&A. It says famine and poverty are always shown as problems manifested by Africans rather than policies of the West. Yeah, I think that's an important point because two things that they try to project about Africa. One is uh, that we're responsible for this famine, poverty, when we know that it's been this disruption from starting with the slave trade that disrupted the locations of people and their well-being, and then to colonization that splintered Africa into more than 50 countries. I mean, and no continent that was colonized was ever divided to the extent that Africa has been divided. So that it created this backdrop on the colonialism that has led to all of the problems, and then continuing it on under neo-colonialism with the various policies, from its trade policies to the way that it forces the devaluation of our currency, to the fact that it not only is it taking our raw materials that are extracted and deciding the pricing of it, but it also is forcing many states to agree to exploitive arrangements in order to just have those types of revenues from that are limited from these extractive situations, so that they get to determine, for instance, the mining corporations get to determine the wages, how much we actually get paid, or our miners get paid in Southern Africa. They get to determine, uh, the the value of the ore that's taken out. They get to decide, how much of the ore they're going to take directly out and process somewhere else, instead of processing in country and giving more jobs and more value to the states in Africa. So definitely, we understand that the nature of this exploitation that has led to the poverty, uh, unemployment, the famine that exists. The second thing that they want to often project is that the inability for our governments to operate more efficiently is solely a result of our corruption and our ineptitude, and that we were better off under apartheid or colonialism. This is the image they want to project. And this is why I think it's important. While we have neo-colonial agents, clearly that operate at different levels, some are more extremely, collaborative, like a Mobutu was in the Congo, and some of them are craftier and more pragmatic, like a Kagame. But we realize that they're part of a neo-colonial apparatus. But I think too often the onus is being placed on Africans. They say that somehow we are stupidly electing or allowing these leaders, and that things were better under colonialism or things were better under apartheid. And they want to ignore the fact that what has happened now under neo-colonialism, this new form of colonialism, that it has extended the ability for these forces of imperialism to operate. And this is why I was giving the example of how the divide has increased in occupied Tanzania since the end of apartheid, and how these multinationals from the insurance industry and banking industry on the finance side to the manufacturing ones like the auto industry here to the mining have all been legitimized now that Africans in South Africa can vote. There's no longer this effort to deter these companies. I remember when we were fighting apartheid and we boycotted Shell and uh, IBM, and Kodak was organized so that they stopped the Kodak from being here. I know I was engaged working at HP in the 70s, and we attempted to close down operations here. So now all of these entities are now become legitimized, and they can operate even more, uh, not only in South Africa but across Africa. And then you have a major food industry shopping chain here that now operates across Southern Africa and other places, setting up malls and large supermarkets that have been legitimized as an African company. So I think this is uh, the reality that we're faced with, and and why it's so important to identify the insidious nature of neocolonialism. And while one of the things that we have to be tasked with is studying the particularities of how neocolonialism plays out in these different environments. It was a neocolonial venture that destroyed Libya. That was a direct military. I mean, it was NATO that sat on out there in the Mediterranean and lobbed rockets across from Benghazi to Tripoli that just totally destroyed uh, one liberated area that we had at the time. And this is uh, should be viewed as a neo-colonial engagement that took place to bring Libya in line. I mean, what they've done over the years in Somalia in terms of military engagement is similar. This is the cutting leading edge in terms of militarism as part of neocolonialism that we see in terms of actually uh, uh, taking it to a direct warfare level in terms of maintaining this new colonial relationship. And this is why it's so important that we push back on AFRICOM, which is just an extension of in collaborating with the NATO efforts that we have to see as a negative force. Just as one of the chats, he was pointing out how Kagame's and some received some military training in the U.S. This is it's not unusual. We have too many militaries in Africa that are collaborating. Just this past week, the U.S. is here in occupied Tanzania doing a joint military activity with the South African military. So this is becoming more and more pervasive, and you have African countries that are allowing this under the guise of, oh, that we're getting training, or because it's packaged with other kinds of goodies. Uh, but it's really an insidious effort to extend the militarism of the major capitalist, imperialist, neo-colonial force in the world, the United States of America. So I don't know if there are other comments. I wish it was we had the ability for people actually to speak out. It says, okay, is there a healthy balance of anti-neocolonialism and pragmatism formula? Okay, that that is, I think, an interesting one. I, I I've come to a point where I don't try to say, okay, even, and this is what I learned from being in Rwanda, and I had a number of people who spoke to the need of feeling that it was need for them to be pragmatic because they'd experienced genocide, a genocidal situation, and they had a real fear of this reoccurring if they didn't tread lightly. So I don't feel I'm in a position to tell activists in any particular area that this is the approach that they must take in terms of this. Um, but I think as a collective, and this is why it's important, I think that we collectively organize a revolutionary African intelligentsia and be able to study these various situations, and on one hand, not try to claim that we know all of what's going on in areas that we've never even been, um, and but at the same time, not try to go to the other extreme to think that because I live in a certain place, or my family grew up in a certain place, that I know all of what has to be done. But I think it requires much more of a Pan African effort. I think that there needs to be more effort to assert with the African Union the fact they're not doing their job. There needs to be one of the things that we've discussed here, for instance, is the Pan African Parliament meets in Midrand, which is about a 30-minute drive from where I live here in Tshwane, which is known as Pretoria, about a 20-minute drive from Johannesburg for those living there. And they meet several times a year, the Pan African Parliament, and it's a venue where we could have activism that demands that, as a quote Pan African Parliament, that you act as such. And right now, there is no real effort to do that, but that's a potential in terms of that. Okay, okay. I saw someone also asking about African engagement in slavery and slave trade. That's something that we know existed, but it was not a dominant piece. Uh, the potential impact African unity can have on Haitian liberation from neo-colonialism. Um, Many of us believe that as Africa becomes stronger, that is really the leverage that we'll have in terms of Africans across the diaspora, whether it's in Haiti or Jamaica, or even the U.S. That the ability for African unity, uh, particularly around gaining control over our resources, which is really the basis of power, that ability to have that power will extend globally. And we see this, for instance, with China. I mean, there used to be this racist type of slur that you don't have a Chinaman's chance, but now people realize China is the second largest power in the world. It makes a difference, and it makes a difference with Chinese wherever they are. says capitalism and imperialism would collapse if all the nations band together to prevent exploitation. That I mean, there are those that are pushing for directly for this internationalism. One of the things that when I spent time talking about um, what I'm calling settler capitalism is that there are those within the left that think it's okay for the U.S. to exist, and all we need to do is bring workers together, uh, and don't recognize that it's basically a settler colony. It's no difference between what the Europeans did in the U.S. and Canada and Australia, and what we see the Zionists now trying to do in Palestine. These are all occupied areas, and even if it's only 1% of the population that remains because of the genocidal efforts in these continents, it still belongs to the indigenous people. So this is important in terms of, as we claim all of Africa and Africans in the diaspora claim Africa, that we reflect on this in terms of the indigenous rights of peoples in Australasia, in the Americas, and recognize the nature of settler capitalism, and really how that has to be addressed in terms of this banding together. And this is why many of us feel that it's Pan-Africanism and our call for the return of land to Africans that will spearhead this effort in terms of indigenous control of land all over, that is really what will expose more and more the settler nature of places like Canada, Australia, and the United States. And this is significant because the land mass that we're talking about and the natural resources that have been extracted and continue to be extracted from these places is immense. And and unfortunately, many white socialist forces don't emphasize this. They just say, "Well, let's bring the workers in Canada together with the indigenous people and call it a day," and that's not, I think, correct. I see it's been. How do you think HBCUs in the U.S. can be utilized as an asset resource in collaboration with African nations to use STEM research in facilitating the implementation of appropriate technologies? Uh, okay. Um, I think this is a good point. This is something that I tried to work with when I was at Howard University, and something that uh, I think requires more people uh, to understand the significance of Africa and understand their Africanism. Um, I found the problem I had more at Howard than was the fact that there was few of us that were on that same page. That unfortunately, um, the academics at the university are more concerned about their careers. And this is also why I think that this effort is going to have to be more driven by the students and the youth who demand that the curriculum and that the resources of universities and the emphasis be placed more on what's needed for Africa's development. And that could be as much as students insisting that the curriculum be more relevant. And this is one of the things that happened in 1997 at Howard, when the African Student Union approached the president and said, we need the curriculum needs to be more relevant for those of us that have come here to study and we're going home to Africa. And there were efforts done in terms of addressing certain courses that would do this. So I think their efforts, and there should be more collaborations than there are, but I think it's going to take more effort from those of us in these STEM areas motivating that. And it's going to have to be more collaboration across HBCUs to do that. And I certainly welcome Baruti, your work on that too. Um, I say, yeah, China and Russia are trying to form a new order and to give the global South a chance to get out from IMF and the World Bank. Um, Yeah, and if you follow the RT news, you'll see that Russia has been printing various things saying, hey, we it's inevitable that this unipolar system that the West insists on is going to end. And if you follow the developments in China, you'll see that they, I mean, are more and more increasingly becoming the manufacturing core, while um, the U.S. has been relying more on its financial manipulation and its current dollar dominance to to keep things in check. But it's bound to fall apart because the root of development is basically on production. And as China is actually more engaged in production, whether it's growing crops or whether it's the largest steel manufacturer, the largest rail manufacturer, and the U.S. tends to try to rely more on its manipulation of its currency by deciding, to raise the interest rates and force people back into a bond market kind of a situation, or earlier on to try to lower the interest rates and increase the value of property and get people to invest in that this kind of manipulation is totally void of any real production. And this is why they're able to do it now because of the domination of capitalism in terms of finance capital and in terms of the dollar. But it's gonna fold in a matter of time. It says, "Don't be fooled. China and Russia can be just as oppressive as the U.S.-led West. Remember, JHC said, black people have no friends. We need to remember that." Um, that's from Gabriel Selassie. I, um, I, I I think that it's important to look historically at the fact that China and Russia did aid the liberation struggles uh, in Africa, while at the same time the U.S. were propping up the colonial forces. So they do not have this colonial history, uh, and they do not have the imperialist history. Now, what is a reality is that China and Russia are operating within the sphere of capitalism, and they are basically state capitalist entities. And particularly if you look at China's operation, because China has more extensive economic activity in Africa, that while the Chinese government has been very pro trying to look at help with the African development, there are many private enterprises, Chinese, that are operating in a capitalist manner, in Africa and other places that they can go because that's their motive of operation. And this is where I think it's important for African states uh, to to be wary of this and to speak out when something is wrong. Okay, let's see. I see Dejan saying, I would disagree mainly because those nations have provided aid to the liberation movements in the past. Africans in Africa need allies. Uh, and Dejan, that's exactly the point that I was raising in terms of that. Um, I see. I'm not sure how we are in terms of time. Okay, so we still have a good 20 minutes, but we can I can address some of these other points. Okay, it was asked earlier. I guess I missed it. What is the relationship of neocolonialism to African unity? Can any country in Africa be liberated without unity? Well, we saw the case of Libya, where I mean, it's a small country that had, in population wide, that has an immense amount of natural resources. They had no debt to the IMF, and they were not only giving a life to most Libyans, but they were providing jobs for many from Central Africa. And yet, we saw the demise orchestrated by neocolonialism under some guise of a UN declaration that we were, protecting the airspace or something nonsense that they tried to project. So we see that the frailty even in a state like that. Uh, so this is why I think it's so important that we progress toward African unity in this process, and that we collaborate more. Many of us have been calling, for instance, Occupy Tanzania to be more forceful in supporting Zimbabwe. Um, I mean, they made some efforts in terms of allowing Zimbabweans to stay under special conditions. Uh, they defended in certain venues the land reclamation, but it's not near enough in terms of what should be happening in terms of states defending uh, Zimbabwe. And the SADC has continuously at each of its previous sessions made calls to end the sanctions uh, on Zimbabwe, but uh, it's going to deaf ear, and we aren't asserting ourselves as Africans more in terms of unified fashion to call for that. Okay, I see from Gabriel Selassie. I lived in China. Chinese are more friendly but equally exploitive. We have African for the Africans. The Chinese have China for the Chinese. The geopolitics are for the Chinese, and if they can help Africa, so be it. But their policies are for the Chinese. Um, yes, it's real that I mean the Chinese are building a very aggressive at building a high level of Chinese self-esteem and Chinese nationalism. Um, I mean, they you constantly are pushing that they are the oldest civilization. Uh, they are now looking to their record in terms of development, um, and 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 that's natural for any state. So um, uh, that I think that at the same time that we are not uh, that we had to be cautious. I think of the capitalist entities that come out of China, uh, and that I think we have to question, for instance, their whole notion of socialism by Chinese characteristics. Is it whether will it ever be really socialism? But I think that they have taken what is a pragmatic approach that has brought uh, literally a billion people out of impoverished situation. So, I mean that track record is there. But what I think is something we have to follow even closer is that their development is the well, the one I think the most significant thing that's pulling us out of this unipolar uh, situation dominated by Western capitalism. So, how that evolves uh, is important, but I think that we have to, at the same time, challenge those forces to be more revolutionary. I don't think there's much effort from, for instance, the Pan African forces to really question and raise the Chinese on any type of organizational level. I mean, the Chinese used to have relationships with liberation movements uh, like ZANU, uh, but and have discussions during the liberation struggle around questions of socialism. But I don't see that happening in any of our relationships with African organizations now, and I think that's something that's overdue. Okay, let's see. Do I see other comments? Okay. Let me see if I have any questions in the Q&A. Okay, 20 minutes ago, how do we know what they have done, how they are going to do it, how they will keep doing it, how do we fight back without being killed? I guess that's in relationship to, the aggression of the neo-colonial forces. And this is why I think it's important to put a emphasis on organizing African revolutionary intelligentsia, because it's that force that can effectively, on a global level, better analyze the situation we're currently faced with in its historical legacy, and are in the best position to then work with all the sectors of the African community to work towards solutions. Um, and with that type of situation, with that type of force, we can then more effectively combat everything from the misinformation that we get, the misunderstanding that our people have, so that we can effectively organize. To be more effective organizers, we have to be able to present much better what is going on, so that we have to better understand and therefore be able to present better what neocolonialism is. We have to better understand and be able to better present why socialism is a viable alternative, and why some people may claim to be socialists when they're not. So all of these things, require us to study and to organize collectively, and this is one of the things we're calling for. Okay, in terms of plebiscites for large loans and agreements, one of the things that the All African People's Revolutionary Party was calling for was cancellation of all debt. It still is calling for cancellation of all debt. IMF, World Bank, Club of Paris, credit cards, for the African community, in terms of this being a down payment for reparations owed for all of the enslavement, stealing of our land and our resources that's taken place not only in Africa but on a global level. This requires a concerted global effort to talk and deal with anything on that level. I see also, are there any progressive revolutionary governments in Africa today? This would require a close assessment. Uh, I, I would say, based on what limited information I have, that right now the answer is no, in terms of revolutionary. Now, yeah, progressive, certainly, to the land reclamation process in Zimbabwe is a progressive move. They haven't uh, gone to the extent of what Cuba did, nationalize everything. I think that under President Mugabe, he was pushing for efforts to call for at least 51% ownership of all industry and all banking. And the neo-colonial pressure was so intense that his old party backed away from that. So when you're in this kind of squeeze, uh, as a ruling party, I don't think you can really consider this, unless you just take it to the full scale, and you operate, and it forced a situation where you're back in armed struggle. So, and this is the dilemma, where I think we have progressive moves that are certain governments are taken in the global south, but very limited in terms of what we could call revolutionary, because of the extensive nature of neocolonialism and its many tentacles. And this is what this whole session I'm trying to drive home, is that the difficulty that exists and why we need to have a global effort. It's going to be the forces from the ground up, the people, the masses. There's going to be the revolutionary forces that are not in power that come to point out all of these inconsistencies of neocolonialism that will end up at one point seizing the day. Uh, and that's where we have to work much harder. Are there uh, any? I don't see any additional questions. I think I'm trying to see if I answered all of the ones that were listed. Okay, so I, like I said, I wish it was a situation where I could actually have people speak out, and instead of trying to scroll through chats and see if I missed any. Um, and unfortunately, as a facilitator, I don't have that ability. But I think in a smaller setting like this, where it's not like we have hundreds of people online, that it would have been better if we had that kind of ability. But I do want to, so I'm going to end, since I don't see any new uh, questions or comments, with the points, reiterating the points that it's so critical that we study and get a better understanding of these many faces of neocolonialism, and that we should use Nkrumah's classic on neocolonialism as a guideline for that, because it is still very apt. And what he does is point out just the different facets of it, and highlighting in that book, at that time, the interlinking of these directorates and people and companies on boards that that were really running the show when it came to not only the extractive industries, but manufacturing and finance and insurance across Africa. And this continues. I mean, it's reshaped some, but it's basically continuing today. It has a few black faces on it, like one of the major mining entities that he writes about in at that time. Now you have the chairman of the board is Musepi, who is an African in South Africa, and is part owner because he's bought into this multinational mining conglomerate. But it doesn't change the dominant nature of this in terms of it being a neocolonial apparatus. Uh, so they'll have a few people who are part of this mining uh, conglomerate, from Cyril Ramaphosa to Musepi, uh, but it's still dominated by the same broad forces that exist. And it requires us to better understand the different aspects and the different forms that neocolonialism takes in these various states. And those that are living in different places in Africa, encourage you to look at the particularities and see the differences from what's happening in a Kenya versus a Nigeria versus Zambia. So if we better understand the enemy, we can better expose the enemy, and we can use this exposure in terms of the awful things they're doing to galvanize our people uh, to organize and uh, to come together across these false state boundaries, so that we can eventually put an end to neocolonialism. But it's going to take this organization, and I'm thanked again the organizers of this conference. One of the things they're trying to do is bring various of our various organizations together to do this. And I'm going to end at this point, and I'm actually going to try to shift to get into the tail end of the session on. It should still be going on the on the political, uh, the All African Political Coordination Committee that's being organized by my comrades in the Pan Africanist Congress and ZAPO. So thank you, everyone.